Daisy Carter yanked her coat tighter around her body as the icy Manhattan wind cut through the crowded streets. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement, each step splashing through remnants of the evening's rain. She glanced at her phone, frustration tightening her grip. 9:23 p.m. Her Uber was supposed to be here 10 minutes ago. Of course, she muttered under her breath. This night was already off to a fantastic start. Willow would never let her hear the end of it if she missed even a second of the engagement party. She scanned the curb for any sign of a black SUV, the one she had booked. A sleek black Escalade was idling a few feet away, the glow of its headlights cutting through the damp city night. Finally, without hesitation, Daisy strode toward the vehicle, yanked open the back door, and slid into the warm leather seat. About time, she exhaled, tossing her bag onto her lap. Only then did she realize something was off. The atmosphere inside the car wasn't the quiet, impersonal hum of an Uber ride. Instead, it was charged, crackling with an energy she couldn't immediately place. A faint scent of expensive cologne lingered in the air, warm, deep, with an edge of something unfamiliar. It was then that she noticed the man sitting beside her. He wasn't the driver. He wasn't even in the front seat. He was in the back, right next to her. Daisy's breath caught as she turned to get a better look at him. The man, because there was no mistaking that he was a man, not some distracted intern or businessman glued to his phone, sat with an unmistakable air of confidence. The sharp lines of his black suit complemented his broad frame, his sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the glint of an expensive watch. His dark brown hair was neatly styled, but it was his eyes, piercing, stormy gray, that locked onto hers with quiet amusement. A slow smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. "You're not my driver," she blurted, her voice slightly breathless. He raised a brow, clearly entertained. "Number I'm not." Daisy's stomach twisted. Wait. She quickly glanced at her phone screen, her stomach sinking as she stared at the Uber app. The little car icon showing her ride was still 3 blocks away. Oh. Oh no. A sinking feeling of dread pooled in her stomach. "This isn't my Uber," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The stranger's smirk deepened, and he leaned back, crossing his legs with an easy, unbothered air. "Nope," he said, enunciating the word just enough to make it clear he was enjoying every second of her realization. "Unless you happen to be someone named Oliver." Daisy's face burned. She clamped her mouth shut, suddenly mortified. How had she not double-checked? How had she just climbed into a stranger's car like this? The driver, a sharply dressed man who looked entirely too professional to be an Uber driver, cleared his throat from the front seat. "Mr. Sterling, should I pull over?" Daisy froze. Sterling. Her gaze snapped back to the man beside her. His smirk remained, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, like he was waiting for her to put the pieces together. And then she did. Calvin. Calvin Sterling. The name hit her like a freight train. Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Enterprises, billionaire, powerhouse in the world of finance. A man so ridiculously wealthy that he could probably buy every Uber in Manhattan just to prove a point. And she had just barged into his car like an absolute fool. The weight of the moment pressed in around her, but before she could say another word, Calvin exhaled, tapping his fingers against his knee thoughtfully. "Where are you headed?" he asked, as if this were a totally normal situation. Daisy blinked, still trying to process how she'd gone from waiting for an Uber to sitting beside one of the most powerful men in the city. She hesitated. "The Plaza Hotel." His brows lifted slightly. Interesting. Her suspicion flared. Why? Calvin's smirk returned, lazy and knowing. Because that's where I'm going too. Daisy's mind scrambled for logic. What were the odds? Was this some kind of weird cosmic joke? She could demand to be let out, could insist that this was the single most ridiculous mistake she'd ever made and walk the rest of the way. But she also knew that in this weather, finding another ride would be impossible. She exhaled sharply, deciding to deal with this later. Fine, she muttered, but don't get any ideas. Calvin chuckled, running a hand through his hair, his voice dripping with amusement. Sweetheart, you're the one who got into my car. Daisy ignored the way her stomach flipped at the way he said that word. Instead, she turned her gaze to the rain-streaked window, arms crossed, determined to make this the most uneventful ride of her life. But as she would soon learn, Calvin Sterling had very different plans. The silence in the car stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Daisy kept her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window, determined to pretend this wasn't happening. She had exactly 10 minutes until they reached the plaza. 10 minutes of sitting in this car, next to Calvin Sterling, without doing or saying anything that would make this situation even more mortifying than it already was. Calvin, however, didn't seem to share her goal of ignoring the elephant in the room. You don't seem like the plaza type, he observed. Daisy narrowed her eyes and slowly turned to look at him. And what exactly is the plaza type? His smirk widened. Overdressed, pretentious, bored. She scoffed. You just described half the people in this city. He shrugged, the movement effortless, practiced. And yet you seem different. Daisy clenched her jaw. She wasn't about to play into whatever game he was starting. Look, let's just get something straight, she said, shifting slightly in her seat to face him. I'm not interested in being your next distraction, okay? I got in this car by accident and in about... She checked her phone. 8 minutes? This mistake will be over, and we'll go back to our completely separate, completely different lives. Calvin didn't react. In fact, he barely blinked. Instead, he tilted his head, studying her like she was some kind of puzzle he had just decided was worth solving. And yet, he mused, you're still here. Daisy's lips parted slightly, caught off guard by the remark. She could have demanded the driver pull over, could have walked the remaining distance in the rain, but she hadn't. And now Calvin Sterling was looking at her like he had already figured that out before she did. She huffed, breaking eye contact. Whatever, she muttered, crossing her arms. Let's just get through this ride without any more conversation. Calvin chuckled, low and smooth, before finally relenting. The rest of the ride passed in relative silence, aside from the occasional sound of raindrops tapping against the roof. As they neared the plaza, Daisy exhaled in relief, already preparing to forget this night ever happened. But of course, the universe wasn't done with her yet. The moment the car rolled to a smooth stop under the grand entrance, a uniformed valet immediately approached to open Calvin's door. Before Daisy could even react, Calvin stepped out first, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket with casual ease. Daisy reached for the door handle, only to freeze when she noticed something unsettling. People were staring, not just glancing, staring. She followed their gazes and realized with a sinking feeling that Calvin Sterling wasn't just any man walking into the plaza. He was someone here. The moment he stepped out, whispers spread like wildfire. Even the valet straightened his posture as he greeted Calvin with an air of rehearsed formality. Daisy's stomach twisted. Oh, this was bad. If she stepped out now, right after Calvin, she would look like she had arrived with him. And if the way people were reacting to him was any indication, that was not the kind of impression she wanted to make. Nope. No, thank you. Daisy was about to sink further into the seat, waiting for him to disappear into the hotel lobby, when she heard his infuriatingly amused voice from outside the car. Are you coming? Her jaw clenched. Unbelievable. Slowly she exhaled, straightened her dress, and stepped out of the car, determined to make this as casual as possible. The moment her heels touched the pavement, she felt the weight of 100 curious stares pressing in on her. And standing right there, watching her with that same knowing smirk, was Calvin Sterling. Daisy refused to let him win whatever game this was. She lifted her chin, flipping her hair over her shoulder as she turned to face him. You never told me your name, she said, forcing an even tone. His gaze flickered with something unreadable before he replied, smoothly and effortlessly, Calvin. Daisy let the name settle between them, though she already knew exactly who he was. She took a slow breath. Well, Calvin, thanks for the ride. But this is where we go our separate ways. And with that, she turned on her heel, walking into the hotel without looking back. Or at least that had been the plan. What Daisy didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this wasn't the last she would see of Calvin Sterling. Not even close. Because in a ballroom just ahead, filled with New York's elite, their worlds were about to collide all over again. Daisy stepped into the grand lobby of the plaza, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor as she forced herself to steady her breath. The moment she had walked away from Calvin Sterling, she had told herself she was done with him. A fluke, a mistake, a ride she'd rather forget. But as she entered the glittering ballroom filled with New York's elite, she realized she was about to see him again. The space was dazzling, the kind of luxury that made Daisy feel out of place even before she stepped in. Golden chandeliers bathed the room in a warm glow, reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling mirrors that made the space seem even grander. A string quartet played softly in the background, and the air was thick with the scent of roses, champagne, and exclusivity. Her grip on her clutch tightened. She had grown up knowing how to navigate this world. After all, Willow had always belonged here. But Daisy? Daisy had never quite fit in. Finally, came an exasperated voice. Daisy turned just as Willow appeared in front of her, looking flawlessly composed, her champagne-colored gown hugging her figure in just the right way. Her blonde hair was twisted into a sleek updo, her diamond earrings catching the light with every movement. The perfect Whitmore bride. You're late, Willow whispered, looping her arm through Daisy's and steering her deeper into the ballroom before she could protest. Daisy sighed. I had a delay. Willow gave her a pointed look, her eyes narrowing. Define delay. Daisy considered telling her the truth, that she had spent the last 10 minutes in a car with one of the most powerful men in the city by complete accident. But then she thought better of it. Willow had enough on her plate without Daisy adding to the chaos. Never mind, she muttered instead. I'm here now, aren't I? Willow hummed in response, clearly unconvinced, but let it slide. They weaved through the crowd, past conversations about business mergers, luxury yachts, and winter homes in the Hamptons. Daisy had mastered the art of nodding politely without actually engaging, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew Calvin was here, and sure enough, she spotted him. He was standing near the bar, engaged in conversation with a sharply dressed older man, his posture relaxed but commanding. effortlessly powerful. His dark suit fit him perfectly, his presence drawing attention even without trying. And then, as if he could sense her, Calvin turned. Their eyes met across the room. Daisy's breath hitched. The smirk he gave her was subtle, barely there, but she caught it. He knew she was watching. Damn it! Before she could even react, Willow suddenly tightened her grip on Daisy's arm, pulling her attention away. "Daisy, this is Mr. Whitmore," she said in a carefully neutral tone. Daisy turned her head, coming face to face with Victoria Whitmore's husband, Andrew's father. And just like that, the evening took a turn she hadn't anticipated. Mr. Whitmore extended a hand toward Daisy, his expression polite but unreadable. He was a man who had built his fortune on Wall Street, the kind of power player who could make or break someone's career with a single conversation. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, and his steel blue eyes flickered with the kind of measured interest that made Daisy's stomach tighten. "So," he said smoothly, his voice carrying an edge of curiosity, "you must be the younger Carter sister. I've heard quite a bit about you." Daisy forced a polite smile as she shook his hand. "All good things, I hope." His lips curved, though his eyes remained sharp. Of course. She wasn't sure she believed that, but before she could respond, another voice joined the conversation, one she had hoped to avoid for the rest of the evening. "I see you've met Daisy." That voice. Him. She knew before she even turned that Calvin had approached, and sure enough, when she shifted slightly, he was there, standing just a little too close, exuding the kind of quiet dominance that made people take notice. His presence changed the air around them, drawing eyes and attention without him having to say another word. "Calvin," Mr. Whitmore greeted, his tone warming ever so slightly. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." "I had a last-minute change of plans," Calvin replied easily, though Daisy caught the quick flicker of amusement in his gaze when it landed on her. "And I'm glad I did." Daisy stiffened. Oh, he was enjoying this. Andrew Whitmore joined the circle, shaking Calvin's hand with practiced familiarity. "Good to see you again. I take it you've met Willow's sister." Calvin's lips twitched, but his expression remained cool. "We ran into each other earlier," he said smoothly. Daisy refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. Instead, she turned back toward Mr. Whitmore, ignoring the way Calvin was watching her like he was waiting for her to slip up. "So," she said, trying to shift the conversation, "I imagine this must be an exciting night for your family." Mr. Whitmore nodded, though there was a distinct lack of enthusiasm in his expression. "Of course. The Whitmores and the Carters, solidifying an alliance. It's a perfect match, don't you think?" Daisy felt Willow tense beside her. She had heard that phrase before. A perfect match. It was the way the Whitmores talked about Willow's engagement, as if it were some calculated merger, rather than an actual relationship. And the worst part? She wasn't entirely sure Willow disagreed with them anymore. Andrew wrapped an arm around Willow's waist, pulling her closer with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're lucky to have her." Daisy forced herself to stay silent, though she wanted nothing more than to shake her sister and say, "Are you seriously okay with this?" Instead, she shifted uncomfortably, searching for a way out of this conversation. But Calvin spoke first. "You don't seem convinced," he said casually, looking directly at Daisy. Her eyes snapped to his, her pulse kicking up a notch. Damn him. She leveled him with a look. "I don't think my opinion is relevant." Calvin tilted his head slightly, studying her. "I think it is." Before Daisy could formulate a response, Victoria Whitmore's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I'm sure Daisy has plenty of opinions," she said, her tone pleasant but laced with condescension. She had arrived unnoticed, her presence commanding, as always. Dressed in an elegant navy gown, her diamonds gleaming under the chandeliers, she looked every bit the part of a woman who had shaped the social elite for decades. Daisy turned toward her, keeping her expression neutral. "Mrs. Whitmore," she greeted. Victoria offered a polite smile. "Lovely to see you again, dear. I trust you're enjoying the party?" Daisy knew better than to believe the warmth in her tone. Victoria didn't ask questions she didn't already know the answers to. "I am," Daisy said, matching her politeness. Victoria hummed, then turned her gaze to Calvin. "I have to admit, I'm a bit surprised to see you here, Calvin. You don't usually attend these kinds of social events unless there's something in it for you." Daisy barely suppressed a smirk. Even she had to admit. That was a bold move. Calvin, however, didn't look the least bit fazed. He lifted his glass of whiskey with a slight smirk. "What can I say? I was in the neighborhood." Victoria's expression remained unreadable, though there was a flicker of something behind her gaze. Calculation. Daisy had seen that look before, and then, as if to make the night even worse, Victoria turned back to her. "And how is your career, dear? I imagine journalism must be challenging in today's world." There it was. The dig. Daisy knew what Victoria was implying, that unlike the rest of the people in this room, she wasn't part of their carefully curated elite. She wasn't the daughter of a powerful family or the wife of a billionaire. She was just Daisy Carter. She could feel Calvin watching her, waiting to see how she would respond. Daisy met Victoria's gaze head-on, refusing to shrink under her scrutiny. "Challenging, yes," she said evenly. "But I suppose I've always liked a challenge." There was a beat of silence, just long enough for her words to land. And then Calvin chuckled. Actually chuckled. "Now that," he mused, "is something I believe." Victoria's smile tightened, but before she could respond, another figure approached the group, a staff member whispering something into her ear. Whatever it was enough to pull her attention away. "Well," she said smoothly, "enjoy the evening, all of you." She walked away, taking Andrew and Mr. Whitmore with her, leaving Daisy, Willow, and Calvin behind. The moment they were gone, Willow exhaled a breath, her expression unreadable. "Well, that was fun." Daisy shot her a look. "Are you seriously okay with this?" Willow hesitated, too long, before giving a small, practiced smile. "It's just one night." Daisy's stomach sank. She had seen that look before, the kind of quiet resignation that came when someone didn't want to admit they were trapped. Before she could say anything else, Calvin spoke, his voice quieter than before. "She doesn't have to go through with it, you know." Daisy turned to him, brows furrowing. "And what exactly do you think you know about my sister's situation?" Calvin's gaze was steady. "I know what it looks like when someone's about to make the biggest mistake of their life." Daisy felt her pulse skip, because for a split second, there had been something in his voice, something that almost sounded personal. But before she could ask, a voice echoed through the ballroom, signaling the start of the formal introductions. Andrew and Willow were about to be presented as the next great power couple. Daisy glanced at her sister. Willow gave her a small, reassuring smile, but Daisy saw the truth in her eyes. And for the first time that evening, she wasn't sure if she was the only one who wanted to run. The ballroom fell into a hushed anticipation as the master of ceremonies took the stage, his voice rich and authoritative as he announced the introduction of Andrew Whitmore and Willow Carter. A spotlight illuminated the grand staircase at the far end of the room, where the couple stood poised and elegant, the very image of a perfect match, at least in the eyes of everyone watching. Daisy, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She watched as Andrew placed a hand at the small of Willow's back, guiding her forward